Remember the first parts of Genesis? Where God laid out his purpose for his people. It was to worship him. We saw how Adam and Eve started off worshiping him but descended into rebellion. We saw how the people at Mount Sinai started off worshiping him, descended into rebellion. This lesson is about the third king of Israel, who starts off worshiping God beautifully, but then soon descends into full rebellion.
Here in session 10, we are going to look at the third king of Israel. If you remember the last session, we looked at the first two. Saul, this humanly studly example of a man that depended on himself and refused to admit his sin. And the second king, David, who wasn't quite that impressive and yet had a habit of depending on God when he was confronted with his sin. The sin of adultery, the sin of murder, he repented. Well, the woman that he committed adultery with, Bathsheba, they actually have a son, and the son's name is Solomon, and Solomon becomes the third king of Israel. David has died, and now his son takes over his kingdom. Solomon's an interesting story. I think you could sum it up like this. It's a great start and an awful finish. Solomon starts like his dad. He leads the people of Israel in worship of Yahweh. He, in fact, builds the temple for Yahweh. Up until this point, God had kind of met with his people in a tent, and here he builds a temple, this building that God has enabled Solomon to build for himself. This temple where God would meet with his people. I mean, that's a pretty cool start, don't you think? It gets even better. At one point, God comes to Solomon in the night and asks him for whatever he wants. God would give him whatever he wants, and Solomon asks for wisdom to lead well. That's a pretty good start. God gives him wisdom. In fact, in the books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, you can read these expressions of Solomon's wisdom. They're the wisdom writings of the Bible. Solomon builds the temple. Solomon rules wisely. Solomon leads his people well, except Solomon allows his household to be led astray. God has told Solomon not to take wives from foreign people because in doing so they will bring their foreign gods into his home and he might be led astray. And apparently Solomon kind of liked the ladies because Solomon goes against God's command and brings these women from other tribes, from other nations, from other people groups into his home and takes them as his wives, and lo and behold, they bring with them their false gods. And Solomon falls prey to his wives. He gives in to his wives. Does that sound familiar? That we might be led astray maybe by relationships that we have with other people, that maybe we think, well, it can't be that bad. I'll be friends with that person, or I'll do this, or I'll follow up with that. And in the midst of that, we compromise our dependence on God. They lead us astray. Well, that happens to Solomon. He marries all these foreign women. They bring in their false gods, their idols into his home, and Solomon begins to worship them. And that worship leads to full-scale rebellion. And so what begins with Solomon is so good turns so bad. In fact, in 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 9 and 10, we read these words. And the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods. But he, Solomon, did not keep what the Lord commanded. he turned away. He went his own way, and with him, as we'll see next week, with him is going to go the whole of Israel. God's people are going to be fractured and led astray because Solomon chose to follow his wives, chose to honor them above honoring God, chose to worship their false gods instead of worshiping the one true God, the God that had given him wisdom, the God that had spoken to him, the God that had met with him in the temple. Instead of that God, he followed his heart. He followed the gods of his wives. He went against God's word. I wonder how many of us find ourselves in the midst of relationships, be they romantic relationships in high school or adult relationships or whatever, where we're allowing ourselves to be led astray from what God has commanded us to do and to be as his people. I wonder if maybe we sometimes start good and finish poorly. This is the story of Solomon, the third king of Israel.
Today we're going to talk about what gets you off track as a family. We all know that we go along well in life and suddenly we find ourselves in places that we never thought we'd be, and we don't really have a good understanding of how to get back on track. We hope this week will give you that insight and that knowledge to find where you've gotten off track with the Lord and how to bring your family back in line. We hope you enjoy your time together and that it's a profitable time.